The convent bells rang for the very last time. High in the hills of Thessaly, olive trees shivered in the fall wind, as a small group of nuns met in their fading chapel. They prayed under cracked paintings. Saints whose faces were scraped away by time and sadness. On the horizon, fire glowed. You could already see the Ottoman banners. Red flags fluttering like sparks over the mountains. The women knew exactly what this meant. No riders were coming from nearby towns. No soldiers were left to protect them. Only the silence before the takeover. Their abbess, Sister Eleni, stood at the altar. She held a silver cross that had lasted through 100 years of storms. She whispered, "If they break our walls, keep your vows in your hearts. They can't take that." But she was wrong. When the empire's armies got to the convent gates, vows, prayers, and holy ground meant nothing against what history tried to forget. If you're into real records from the Ottoman Byzantine frontiers, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us dig up more stories buried in the archives, from missionary letters to Vatican reports. Now, back to the story. The convent's first stones fell before sunset. The hymns that once filled the halls were drowned out by iron and screams. The Ottomans didn't waste arrows on holy places. They broke the gates with cannon fire. It was both a warning and a statement. To them, a convent wasn't holy ground. It was a symbol of resistance, proof the cross still dared to stand on conquered land. Inside, the sisters hid their holy treasures, silver cups, stitched icons, pieces of saint bones, under the chapel floor. They hoped if their bodies were lost, their faith might still last. But the soldiers weren't looking for treasure. They wanted proof they had crushed not just the enemy's armies, but their God. By nightfall, the nuns who survived were pushed into the courtyard. Torchlight made their white robes look like moving gold and shadow. They were told they'd be taken to the Pasha, a promise few ever lived to see. What happened next became legend, so dark that even church writers skipped the details. By dawn, the convent was just ash. Smoke rose from the dining hall where the women once shared bread and silence. Ottoman flags flew from the bell tower, telling other units that the fight was over. But in that courtyard, something strange happened. The soldiers expected screams, but they heard singing. Tied with rope, the surviving sisters started to sing a hymn. Not of sadness, but of defiance. The Agnus Dei. Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Their voices shook but never broke. The Ottoman captain, not sure if he should laugh or shut them up, ordered the abbess dragged forward. Eleni still held the silver cross she'd saved from the altar. The captain promised her mercy. If she denied her God and accepted the conqueror's faith, her sisters would live. Her answer sealed her fate. "I have already given my life. What else can you take?" The captain paused, maybe he was moved. Then he turned away, leaving her to his men. What happened next was never written down completely. Even Ottoman records, which celebrated victory, just called it discipline for those who refused reason. But in European letters, her name appeared again, Eleni of Lissa, the nun who would not kneel. By noon, the convent's bells were melted for coins, and the rooftop cross was shipped east as a trophy. But soon, rumors started in the nearby villages. They said that when the wind blew through the ruins at night, you could still hear women's voices, not crying, but praying. The smoke had barely cleared when the march started. What was left of the order? 22 women in torn robes were forced south toward the coast. Ankles tied, watched by Ottoman horsemen. To the empire, they weren't prisoners of war, but symbols of victory, proof that even holy walls could fall. The journey was brutal. The sun baked the road. The sisters, who had never left their convent, stumbled from thirst and tiredness. When one fell, another would lift her veil so soldiers wouldn't step on it. A last act of dignity in a world with no mercy. Their abbess was gone, but her last words lived on with them: "If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other." After 7 days of walking, the prisoners reached the port of Volos. Waiting there were Ottoman galleys, ships built not for comfort, but for control. The women were pushed on board, wrists chained to wooden benches where criminals and slaves used to sit. As the sails filled with wind, the shores of Greece faded away, and with them, everything they had ever known. The ship's boss, Yusuf Aga, kept detailed records, cargo, spices, coins, cloth, and religious prisoners. It was this exact book, found centuries later in the Istanbul archives, that proved a story once called a legend. The trip to Constantinople took 12 days. Storms hit the deck. Salt stung their wounds. Hunger carved out their faces. But what broke them most wasn't the pain. It was the silence. No one spoke to them, except to yell orders. They were like ghosts, floating between the sky and the sea. At night, the youngest, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms under her breath. Her voice was weak, almost impossible to hear over the crashing waves. But even the chained prisoners around her, Greeks, Serbs, and Italians, turned their heads to listen. For a moment, the sea itself seemed to be quiet. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rise before them. Its domes and minarets glowed like blades in the dawn. Across the water, the city seemed alive, breathing with power. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now, it would become their cage. From the docks, they were marched through narrow streets lined with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. People stopped to stare. Christian nuns among captives were a rare sight, even in an empire built on conquest. They were led past the ancient walls of Blacherny, toward the imperial district where their fates would be decided. In the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, the once great cathedral of their faith, they were forced to kneel. As the call to prayer echoed from the minarets, one of the sisters whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Before dawn, they were taken into a marble courtyard surrounded by tall columns. This wasn't a dungeon. It was the divan, the imperial council, where the sultans will ruled over everything. Here, captives weren't judged by kings or priests, but by the empire itself. For the nuns of Thessaly, their faith would be tested against the laws of conquest. At the center of the hall sat the Grand Vizier, a man whose face showed nothing. To his left, scribes waited with ink and paper, ready to write down every detail, names, ages, and intended uses. Every word would be put into registers that still exist centuries later, stained by wax and time. The sisters stood in their torn robes, eyes down. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had offered mercy on one condition. Those who converted would be given new names, food, and a life in the palace. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a phrase that could mean prison, or just disappearing. No one spoke. Sister Magdalena trembled. She had seen what happened to other captives brought before the vizier. Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, all swallowed by the empire's silence. Before the guards could drag her forward, one of the elders, Sister Dearest, stepped out of line. She spoke to the vizier, not as a captive, but as someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and fall. "My lord," she said, "you may rename us. But you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry." The interpreter paused, not sure if he should translate such words. When he did, the vizier's face stayed like stone. Then he replied, coldly, "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a wave of his hand, the sisters were dismissed. Not to execution, but to the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were kept. Some would call it mercy. Others would later call it something far worse. Some were given a different kind of prison, one disguised as service. Beneath the palace gardens lay a maze of stone halls, sealed off from the sun. Each room had a thin slit for light, barely enough to tell night from day. The nuns were stripped of their robes, dressed in rough clothing, and told they would now serve, cleaning floors, sewing clothes, feeding fires for the upper rooms. It was meant to break them, to turn holiness into servitude. But the Ottomans underestimated them. These were women who had already lived under vows of silence and self-denial. Hunger, cold, and being alone were nothing new. For them, suffering wasn't punishment. It was devotion made real. Even in this underground prison, their discipline became their armor. At night, they prayed in secret. One carved a cross into the clay wall with her fingernail. Another traced verses into the dust under her straw bed. They started counting the days by the rhythm of the muezzin's call. Not out of conversion, but as a defiant clock for a faith that refused to die. Soon, whispers spread among the servants. There were stories of the silent sisters, foreign women buried beneath the palace who never spoke, never begged. Some called them cursed. Others called them saints. Their silence echoed through the tunnels louder than any prayer. Days bled into months. Their hands blistered from work, washing linens, polishing brass, tending fires that gave heat to others, but none to them. Their names were forbidden. Each woman was given a number, a mark of ownership. The empire believed that time and hunger would bend even the strongest faith. That's when the next stage began, a test, disguised as mercy. First came kindness. Food, oil, and silks were sent to their rooms. Learned men from the palace came to speak softly, offering rest, peace, even small freedoms. Your God and ours are not enemies, one imam said. Take our tongue, and you will be free. But they all knew what that freedom meant, erasing the memory of who they were. To forget was the one sin they could not commit. Sister Magdalena, once frail and trembling, began to rise as their strength. She whispered pieces of scripture remembered from their convent, verses half forgotten, reshaped into prayers that kept them alive. Even incomplete, the word survived. When kindness failed, the masks came off. The torches were put out. Food was cut in half. No more kind visits. Only silence and darkness. One by one, they were taken to a narrow room where scribes waited. Each was told to repeat a single phrase of submission. Those who did were allowed to live within the palace walls. Those who refused, disappeared. It wasn't one big act of cruelty, but a slow, careful breaking of the soul. Faith wasn't torn away by force. It was chipped away by hunger, waiting, and the quiet voice asking, why suffer for a God who doesn't answer? A few gave in. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally whispered the words. They were dressed in silk and taken away, never to be seen again. For those who stayed, each disappearance hardened their will. Sister Diris, once brave before the Grand Vizier, grew thin and pale. When guards demanded her name, she smiled faintly. Call me Silence, she said. Her defiance spread like a disease. From that moment, none of them spoke to their captors again. When questioned, they answered only with stillness. And in that stillness, they took back what the empire thought it had taken, control. Official records mention them only in passing. Foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Ottomans, they were failed conversions. To history, they became something else. Living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring came back to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the first 22 were still alive. The guards called them ghosts in rags. But the servants whispered about something stranger. That sometimes, deep in the night, quiet voices could be heard under the palace, chanting in a language no one recalled but everyone feared. It was the same hymn they had sung while their convent burned. And in those forgotten hallways where no sunlight touched, the survivors found something they never expected. An old, sealed archway, buried in dust and stone. At first, it was just a hiding spot, but slowly it became something holy. They used broken pots for candle holders, a piece of linen for an altar cloth. From a piece of a broken mirror, they made a simple cross. In this secret chapel, they met every night after the palace was asleep. No hymns, no sermons, only whispers. Each woman knelt and shared a memory, a home, a church bell, the warmth of bread before sunrise. These memories became their new psalms, small gifts to a God who was still listening in the dark. A Venetian prisoner once wrote of strange voices echoing beneath the harem, women singing in Latin to a God not of this empire. For centuries, historians dismissed it as a myth. Until, beneath the Topkapi ruins, archaeologists uncovered a small room lined with Christian carvings. Silent proof that their prayers had never truly stopped. Crosses scratched into the stone. A Latin phrase, half erased by time, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. That small discovery changed everything. It proved these women had not just vanished. They had left a mark. A silent rebellion etched into the walls. Inside the hidden chapel, Sister Magdalena, once frail, now the center of their faith, began marking the walls with charcoal. Names couldn't be written openly, so she made up symbols instead. A bird for each sister still alive. A small flame for those who had been lost. Whenever a new bird didn't appear, it meant another one had disappeared. The guards never found the chapel. Yet they began to notice strange changes in their captives. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the darkness, the women moved with a quiet, almost unnatural calm. The overseers called it madness. But the scribes watching them wrote down something else entirely. They had found a strength not of this world. Their secret worship continued for months, maybe years. And though the empire tried to erase every trace of their existence, the chapel became their final act of defiance. Not with weapons, not with protest, but through a faith that refused to die. By the time a new sultan rose to power, only a handful of the sisters remained, worn, aged, almost forgotten. Yet beneath the palace, their secret chapel survived. Silent. Hidden. Eternal. Centuries later, when modern explorers dug through Constantinople, no one expected that beneath layers of marble and empire, the fingerprints of these women would still be there. Women who had prayed in darkness, leaving behind the only thing the conquerors could never claim, their faith, carved in stone. By 1482, the palace had changed hands again. A new sultan, young and ambitious, took the throne with orders to wipe out any trace of weakness from the rulers before him. Every servant, concubine, and laborer was carefully recorded, except one group. In the Topkapi archives, under columns of names, there was a blank space. A gap where 21 entries should have been. The ledger read, name redacted, unfit for service, disposed. No dates. No burial records. Nothing. This was how history erased them. Not with fire, but with ink that was never used. And yet, the silence itself became the proof. Only something shameful is hidden so carefully. Centuries later, an Ottoman courtier's diary showed up in the archives of Bursa, mentioning, in code, foreign women who had refused to submit and disappeared beneath the palace foundations. Another letter, caught by Venetian spies in 1484, spoke of nuns who would not bow to the Sultan's will. Together, these pieces revealed a truth the empire had tried to bury. The deliberate erasure of women who had become spiritual symbols of resistance. The last record of Sister Magdalena comes from decades later, written by an Italian pilgrim. He retold a story whispered by a palace servant, of a woman who sang to her God until the guards sealed the room. Her name was unknown, but the faint hymn he described survived the stone itself. In that echo, her story lived on. Over time, tales of the vanished sisters became whispered rumors among slaves and servants. On certain full moon nights, the lower halls of the palace would grow cold, and the air smelled faintly of incense, though no fire burned. Memory, superstition, or both, refused to die. Centuries later, European visitors, drawn to the exotic mysteries of the Ottoman court, heard pieces of the same legend. A French diplomat, writing in 1712, noted that among the older palace attendants, There was a forbidden story of Christian women who had sung themselves into heaven. He dismissed it as a myth. Yet the walls had already told the truth. The chapel lies in ruins now, but the carvings remain. Faded prayers, etched into the walls. A whisper of women who refuse to be forgotten. In their silence, they still speak. And if you've heard their story tonight, let it stay with you. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt when you heard what they went through. And if you want more untold stories, buried in the shadows of history, subscribe and step deeper into the darkness with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much they hurt.